Okay, great. So thanks again, Alick, for joining us this afternoon. Before we start and get into your really interesting presentation, would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself, about your background, just for anybody who might not have heard about you so far and your work with animals?
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I should thank you all for inviting me to come and do this. It's something I've done a couple of times before, and I'm always very pleased to be able to do it. So thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for coming along to listen and watch. As Lauren has said, she'd like me to say a few words about myself, and I've never find that very difficult. So let's start. I'm a former veterinarian. I was a veterinarian for 45 years, but I've just deregistered myself, so I can't call myself that now. But since I retired from full-time government work in 2015, I've been doing a lot of work to do with conservation and the interface between what I would describe animal welfare and wildlife and conservation. So I've been working with the Wild Animal Welfare Committee, which, as you know, is pretty closely linked to One Kind, and I do a bit of work for RSPB, National Trust on Wildlife Management. And I've written a book, and I'll say a little bit about that a bit later on, and that's very much about animal welfare and our attitudes to animals. Quite a bit of what I'll be talking about this afternoon is drawn from that, but it's I've tried to make it sort of pretty accessible, but I'm very conscious that we've probably got a lot of people with different types of background here. So if at any point you feel I'm using too much jargon, then please stick something in chat, but you can also bring it up at the end, because there will be an opportunity to ask a few questions, and I'm very keen to have a bit of a discussion at the end of this. So the talk will go on for 25 to 30 minutes, but there's plenty of time to have a discussion thereafter. Just a word of warning, the one or two of the photographs and videos in this presentation a little bit graphic, because inevitably we're talking about the killing of wildlife, so there will be one or two graphic photographs here. Nothing too horrible, but I'm conscious that one or two people might find it a bit upsetting, so just be warned. So I'll start off now. That's not a very good start. Oh, here we are. Fine. I've got a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence that I bring forward to argue that the way in which we treat animals is wrong, by putting them into various different categories and therefore allowing one group to be worse or better treated than another. That brings us into ethics. So there'll be a consideration of some of the ethical issues that we have to take into account where we're considering how we treat wildlife. And then as a summary of current legal practice, and some of that is quite extraordinary, what the law seems to allow. And this, I would emphasize, is different from a lot of the high profile stuff to do with illegal killing of birds of prey, for example. This is all legal, above board, and authorized by acts of parliament. And having said all of that, I want to talk a little bit about a possible future, about how we might approach things differently, and take into account what we know about the sentience of wild mammals in particular, and birds, which seems to the evidence base is growing, so that we can at least treat wildlife in a way which is broadly similar to the way in which we treat many other animals, which is recognizing that they have the capability to suffer, and that they need to be treated with a bit of dignity and, well, I think care. So let's talk a little bit about evidence. On the right-hand side is dog, highly protected species, with all sorts of laws that protect them. And on the left-hand side is I'm sorry. Okay. How far did I get? Somebody like to say how far I got without being muted?
As a species, they're protected.
Okay, good. Right, I must have pressed the wrong button there. My apologies. Right, I'll keep my fingers away from any buttons. On the right-hand side, a dog, highly protected species, and highly valued by people. Lots of effort goes into protecting this animal from all sorts of harm, and many people put a huge amount of personal effort into caring for their dogs. On the left-hand side is a rat skeleton, and you don't need to be an expert in anatomy to realize that fundamentally the difference between these species is not enormous. They all have the same broadly similar anatomy, a vertebral column, a skull, front and back legs, a rib cage, and inside that is a set of organs which is broadly similar as well. So the idea that you're dealing with entirely different species, which on the left-hand side, the rat, which is almost has no protection at all, particularly in the wild, and on the right-hand side, a dog which is highly protected, starts to unravel as soon as you have the most basic knowledge of how an animal is constructed, so to speak. And this extends more to even into the brain. At the bottom is a rat brain, at the top is a human brain. Now, the anatomy, the mixture of parts and the relative shapes of the various different parts are different. So you can see, for example, you've got a thing called the cerebellum there, which is something that is all to do with about how muscle movements are controlled and modulated. And you have a cerebellum in a rat, and you have a cerebellum in the person, in a human. And similarly, you've also got other bits of the brain which are all there, albeit in different proportions. And it's absolutely clear to me, even though it's quite difficult to say, that this animal, the rat, or for that matter, a fox or any other species that of wildlife that is subject to quite a lot of intervention and perhaps persecution, its ability to comprehend, its ability to suffer, its ability perhaps even to think into the future and worry and yearn may be very, very similar to ours, albeit maybe not quite so sophisticated. But the idea that you can write these animals off as being automatons that don't matter, I think is something which you can sign long into history. I'll talk a little bit about moles a bit later on. Now, mole skeleton is pretty different. As you can see, the forelegs of this animal are absolutely extraordinary. But ultimately, it's the same set of bones, albeit in different proportions, different sizes, to the dog and the rat. So the idea that moles don't count, in my view, is just as daft as sort of saying that dogs and rats don't count either. And this is sort of brings us to this business about ethical considerations. And I've used this phrase here: there's no linear progression from dumb to smart. Going back before Darwin, even probably after Darwin started to talk about evolution and the origin of species and the progression of natural selection, it was often thought that a fish was dumber than a rat, and a monkey was dumber than an ape, and so forth. And what we know now increasingly is that the ability for many species, which we've tended to not take terribly seriously for a long time, is clearly wrong. You've got species which would have been called primitive or backward or barely evolved, like the octopus, or even for that matter, reptiles or crows. Crows in particular, species which their ability to comprehend, communicate, solve problems is extraordinary, and probably they're smarter than dogs. But it's also important, in my view, that you shouldn't necessarily just to say we're going to worry or protect or seek to prevent cruelty on all sorts of species simply about how intelligent they are. Because first of all, it's almost impossible to establish which are the most intelligent animals. But second, it's very, very difficult to say where this group is not worth protecting, whereas this group, on the other hand, is worth protecting. So the assumption or the default is that you treat all vertebrates with a degree of care and dignity simply because you assume, in the absence of any better information, that these animals are sentient and capable of suffering. So when it comes to the species that we care for, it's quite interesting, or perhaps not care for. It's quite interesting when you realize that some species actually get greater care in some circumstances than others. Now, here's three rats. On the left is a wild rat. On the right-hand side at the top is a laboratory rat, and at the bottom right is a pet rat. They're all the same. They might look slightly different, but fundamentally they are the same species. So if a rat is a rat, then the idea that you would put huge amounts of effort into protecting a pet rat, or for that matter, regulating the experience of laboratory rats, and ignore what goes in the wild, is inconsistent at best and really negligent at worst. So if you think wider than this, and it goes back to centuries back, Jeremy Bentham, a British philosopher in the 18th century, was exercised about how we looked after our animals. And one of the things he asked is not that they can reason or can they talk, because we don't really know. Well, we don't know animals can, we know animals can't talk, but they certainly can communicate. We don't know whether they can reason, but we do know, or we can make the assumption that they can suffer. And this notion, this idea that had a bearing on the way in which we regulated animals so that they weren't beaten in the street in the 19th century, changed the way in which we looked at animals. And despite all of that, despite 2 centuries of philosophy and probably nearly 100 years of very clever scientists trying to understand animal consciousness, we're still reaching a point now that we don't know whether they are. And Marion Dawkins in 2017 made a very good intervention, which has been quite influential. I'll read it out here. Animal welfare science, although often defining good welfare in terms of what animals feel, does not have to be based on assumptions about which species have conscious experiences, which goes back to what I said a few minutes ago. Animal welfare, that is well-being, can be defined objectively in terms of of animal health and what animals want. Really what she's saying in a rather roundabout way, and that this is an extract from a much longer paper, is if we wait until the science tells us about consciousness, we will have waited too long, because the information that is going to be needed to be able to establish whether animals are have consciousness is too far away, because we haven't got sophisticated enough tools to be able to establish that. So therefore, the better way is to assume that animals have got needs and wants, and we should provide them. And when it comes to wildlife, we don't. It's as simple as that. And finally, before I move on to sort of some of the bit more sort of detailed stuff about the ways in which animals are treated in the wild, this declaration made by a group of scientists in Cambridge about consciousness is really quite an interesting one, because what they're really saying is that because we know about neurochemistry, neurophysiological substrates, which is essentially about how the brain works, there's enough evidence to indicate that humans are not unique in the possession of neurological substrates that generate consciousness. In other words, non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopus, also possess these neurological substrates. So therefore, we cannot assume that they don't have consciousness. And because of that, we need to treat them because they have. So on accepting that these animals almost certainly have consciousness, or we haven't got evidence to say they haven't, but therefore we should assume they have, then what we've got is quite a mix of ways in which we treat wildlife. And most of what we do in terms of wildlife, the ones that are the most controversial, the ones that people get worried about, relate to the treatment of wildlife that are deemed not to be acceptable, either in their presence or what they do. In other words, inconvenient to somebody else's business, somebody else's way of life, or somebody else's hobby. And it sort of boils down to 4 or 5 separate things. There's the live trapping of corvids, crows, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Snaring, and I'll say a few more words about that. The lethal trapping of mammals, poisons, and we know that those are markedly inhumane, and glue boards. Now, of these 5, there's been a fair bit of change in the last 2 or 3 years. Glue boards are about to be fully banned in Scotland, and possibly there might be 1 or 2 exemptions. Wales has banned snaring, and Scotland is thinking very hard about it. I'm afraid in England, none of these things are being properly looked at. But when we go into sort of a bit of detail, you'll see that these things are pretty unpleasant. I'm not going to talk much more about glue boards or poisons, but I'm going to say a few more words about corvids, snares, and the lethal trapping of mammals. And I should emphasize that a number of these photographs have been provided by one kind, and also Persons, who I think has popped into this, so he may well have a few words to say towards the end of this. Now, this is a ladder trap used for catching corvids, generally on shooting estates, but not exclusively. Certain types of live traps are used by conservation organizations to remove crows from places where, for example, curlews are threatened with being killed by, or the chicks are being killed by crows. Essentially, it is using some sort of lure to get these animals to be attracted to the center of the trap. They drop down through that slot in the middle, and then they're caught there until the keeper comes along and kills them. Now you can see, I think, 3 birds in the top right corner there, and they will stay there until the keeper comes back the following day. Now there's a law which says, I think, no more than 24 hours between visits, and no more, and you can't use them in inclement weather. Now, I think the evidence is pretty strong that this is almost certainly inhumane, simply because these animals are being confined and jammed up close to other birds, which will almost certainly cause them some considerable distress. And then who knows about the competence of the people that are killing these animals, because they're not obliged to be trained. They're not even obliged to be reporting on what they do, never mind being scrutinized about how it's done. Here's magpies, and I think a carrion crow, or no, sorry, I think these are more carrion crows. There's a bit of snow in front of that one that made it look black and white. But this is obviously in really, really unpleasant weather, and this ought not to be taking place, simply because these animals will not be able to get any sensible shelter. Moving on to snaring, which, as I say, has been banned in Wales, and it looks like it may well come to be banned in Scotland before too long. How long, I don't know, but one kind has been at the forefront of doing this. And although in Wales, sorry, in England, the DEFRA, the relevant organisation, has promised to review the use of snares. Nothing has happened, but the more sort of, shall we say, progressive governments in Scotland and Wales are moving towards, or have moved to, a ban. Now, these are pretty nasty things, frankly. They're indiscriminate, in as much that even though they would argue, the keepers would argue, that they set them in a place where non-target species are avoided, it's nonsense. They catch all sorts of things: dogs, cats, even runners' feet, I understand, and badgers. And they really are very, very unpleasant, as well as confining an animal in the open for sometimes as much as 24 hours. These animals will suffer significant injuries, even though a very well set snare will cause little injuries. The ability for many of the gamekeepers to do this, I think, is limited. They're not under any scrutiny. Some of them will have some training, but there's very little statutory control over how these are used. And of course, almost no scrutiny. So of course, you do get these rather unpleasant videos popping up, simply because these beasts are caught. And of course, an animal will pull itself for some considerable time, even though they may not lock. And of course, they're not allowed to lock, because the law tells you that they're not allowed to. There will be some considerable physical damage, and I've absolutely no doubt considerable distress as well. Moving on to what are known as lethal traps. This is what's known as a rail trap, usually put in on grouse moors, but often in other places where people are trying to get rid of stoats and weasels. This is a fen trap with a homemade tunnel. And the idea is that that tunnel only allows animals to come in from either side. That is the long axis of that trunk. So therefore, birds, larger mammals, and perhaps even smaller mammals will not be caught by this. So it will limit itself to, or supposedly limit itself to, the killing of stoats and weasels. Now, the law has changed just recently, and you're now obliged. This is a dead stoat in a trap. That's a fen type trap here. This is a tully trap of the new type, which has been obliged to be introduced for the killing of stoats now, and they're generally pretty effective, but there are so many variables, so many times when non-target species are caught, and also because the people that are using are not trained, not statutory scrutinized. There really is no evidence that this is done in a way which is consistently humane. And I think that this is cause for considerable concern. Now, I was going to say a few bits about moles, and moles is really weird, frankly. On the left-hand side, there are boxes of mole traps that I photographed for sale in a garden centre of all places. Now, you can understand why some gardeners might want these, because of course moles, that once they get into a lawn, can cause quite a bit of, I wouldn't call it damage, but activity, molehills that might appear all over your lawn. But these traps are on free sale to anybody. They're 10 quid a pop. They come with no instructions. I've seen more detailed instructions on a screwdriver, frankly. These are absolutely extraordinary. Anybody can buy them. Anybody can use them. There's no reporting. There's no requirement for training. And there's no scrutiny of what you do. And there's good evidence from a colleague of mine, Sandra Baker, who did some very good work on this, that the traps, because they've never been approved, never been tested in laboratory conditions, do cause these animals horrible injuries, which of course all takes place underground, and these animals almost certainly die slowly rather than quickly, that a well-maintained, well-designed trap would do in the right circumstances. And it's an absolute scandal. Now, what I can say is that National Trust, an organization I've been working with in the last 2 or 3 years, have actually scaled back the amount of trapping at the hands of moles, and they're only allowing it in very special circumstances now. And I think the number of moles that National Trust are killing on their properties now has dropped by about 2/3, perhaps 3/4, which is really rather good news. So something I'm really rather pleased about, because this is something which it just gets built in, like some of the other things we saw about crows or stoats, into the routine of some people, and their mindset is, this is what we do each month. In April or May, we kill moles. Later in the year, we kill stoats, and crows we do in May as well, to maximize the reduction of both youngsters and adults. And it's just built into the psyche and the routine of the work of gamekeepers and some other land managers. And we need to challenge this. It's no good. So what? And I'm conscious that what I've tended to talk about is, it's not so much anecdotal, but it's not really hard science. But trust me, there's a lot of hard sciences behind this. When it comes to spring traps, the type of traps that I was showing you that are used for stoats, and much smaller ones used for mice and rats and so forth, there's Sandra Baker's work shows that there's a big variation in mechanical performance, and there's considerable scope for improving humaneness, because the fact remains that traps for rats, mice, and moles do not need to be approved. Anybody can build them, anybody can sell them, and there's no requirement for anybody to test them for humaneness. And when it comes to the types of traps that are used for stoats, which were introduced only recently, the international standards that apply to them, really, they've been challenged as not being sufficiently good to prove animal welfare. And certainly work that was shown that many of these stoats that are caught in any of the types of traps that is currently used now, even the ones that are being obligatory recently, do not kill these animals quickly, and therefore sometimes, or a high proportion, have to be euthanized when the tests the traps are tested. Mole traps, as I said, Sandra Baker's work shows that the traps almost certainly do not kill these animals immediately, and they die from acute hemorrhage, which might take minutes or hours. And there's no requirement even to check these things. There's a code of practice which says every 24 hours. But the fact is, even if you went after 24 hours, anything you caught in those would have been long dead. It might be dead. It might have taken 3 hours to die. So looking at them after 12 or 18 or 24 hours is a waste of time, because it takes them 3 hours to die. So this is really nonsense. And then when it comes to anticoagulant rodenticides, essentially rat and mice poisons, the government department has specifically said that these are markedly inhumane. So here we have a variety of different ways of killing, and these aren't all of them, killing wildlife. And I would include rats and mice in this, even though obviously perhaps gamekeepers aren't killing these. General public, restaurateurs, homeowners, and I confess to having used mouse traps in my house in recent times because nothing else seems to be able to work. Is the traps, most of them are markedly inhumane, and all the other ways are as well. And anticoagulant rodenticides, other types of rodenticides, even live traps and glue traps are almost certainly inhumane. So we've got this vast number of animals that are killed, and we don't know how many there are, that are being killed regularly in all circumstances by all sorts of people who are not subject to scrutiny. So just to summarize, really, you've got a sort of mindset that pervades this whole issue, which is what I describe as wildlife management in 3 easy steps. One is identifying the problem. Second, deciding on the culprit, and I put culprit in inverted commas because I believe that in many cases it's arbitrary and probably not without any evidence, and then go out and kill it. And it's not much more sophisticated than that, which is all a bit of a problem. So there's a lot of really good work that's gone on behind the scenes by, and these are international principles that have been developed by a group of people, some of which we know well, including Sandra Baker, were involved in developing a set of principles for ethical wildlife control. And there are 7 of them, and I was going to go through these briefly because they really are quite interesting. So starting off with the first of them, and this is, by adopting this, you change the whole approach, they change the whole philosophy, they change the whole practice of dealing with wildlife control or management, whichever way you want to describe it. So what are the alternatives? And it forces you, if you follow this approach, to start by modifying what you do. So rather than saying we have a problem, therefore we have to do something about it by going out and killing them, is there something we could do which prevents us the need for doing this, by either changing the way in which you do a business, by making your building secure so that the rats can't get in, so you don't want to kill them, keeping the food in the house that you have, or keeping the whatever is attracting them into the house under wraps, and therefore they aren't attracted in the first place. And it's a difficult thing to do, but it's something that needs to be built into the entire process of decision making from the get-go. And this is an example which I sort of got involved in, where feral wild boar in a National Trust estate in Wiltshire, they decided they were going to shoot them all because, and this is the thing that they were saying, was that the reason why they were arguing to do it was that members of the public were being confronted and intimidated by wild boar. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen wild boar. The numbers of times that wild boar are actually cause injury to people, I've looked into this, it's absolutely tiny. And most of the time, it's when people haven't got their dog under control. Don't get me started on that. And because the boar or the sow has got piglets at foot, so therefore she feels intimidated rather than the general public. And it's learning to live with wildlife and learning to live with the fact that they will do things that you might not like, but some of it you need to live with, and some of it you need to manage without starting to go out and kill them. And in the end, I think they decided not to do it. So it's all about getting used to wildlife and recognizing that these animals have been here long before we were. And until we actually get this tolerance into the way in which we think about things, it will always be these animals are a nuisance, these animals are getting in the way, these animals are a problem, rather than coming to the conclusion that there's a way of living with it. Now, I'm not suggesting that necessarily we all should have a bear in our shopping mall, but I do suggest that there's ways in which we can live in a way which is more tolerant than we seem to be able to do at the moment. Now, the second one is, where's the evidence? Now, I mentioned when I was being rather rude about people who make these arbitrary decisions about what animals are being killed or what animals are causing the problem. Have you got a good evidence that these animals are the ones that are causing the problem? And do you know whether it's going to work? Because all too often there isn't evidence that supports that. And here's what they said in this article, which I think is worth quoting, is the need for wildlife control should be justified with evidence. Sorry, I've gone. The need for wildlife control should be justified with evidence that substantial harm is being caused to people, property, livelihoods, ecosystems, and other animals. It's not about routine. It's not what you always do. It's about having a good evidence base to support whatever any intervention you're going to do. Moving on, the objectives have got to be clear and achievable. Now, most often it isn't. And here's a couple of examples where I think these are somewhat older now. They've been superseded, but these are two examples of general licenses that are issued by Natural England to allow the killing of wildlife, either to protect fauna or to prevent serious damage or disease. Now, these allow almost anybody who has a piece of land and their agents to kill these species here. But it's open-ended because the licenses get reissued year after year, and albeit there has been some challenge, some successful challenge of these killings, but in essence, what we've got is an open-ended commitment to allow for doing this. And if you don't have something which has got a beginning, a middle, and an end, then the benefit, as Clayton and Cowan say here, is likely to be short-lived, and control actions may need to be used repeatedly without achieving a sustainable solution. So there's no registration, no reporting, and no recording, so you don't know what the effect is anyway. And if you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. Now, I didn't say that. Albert Einstein said that. So without an exit strategy, without some way of knowing when to stop, it's just gamekeeping. Now, I know that winds up people, but it's different. We could do better than this. Is animal welfare given priority? I don't think it is, because we've already seen that many of the methods are pretty unpleasant. And I'll go back to nasty plastic traps, which are almost certainly not effective because they don't have the power. Mole traps, which are equally nasty as well. Animal welfare isn't given priority. Does everyone get a say? Is it open and transparent? Now, I live in the middle of Somerset, and they've been killing badgers around where I live for, I think, 4 or 5 years now. Not only do I not know where the boundaries of the badger killing is, I've never been told it's happening, and I've never been asked what I think about it. So I don't get a say. I don't think many people get a say about the killing of wild birds. This gentleman, Jason Enfield, has done some really good investigatory work by holding Natural England to account. There's very little opportunity for the general public to have any influence over the way in which this is done. And I think this is wrong. These, as Chris Packham would say, these are our birds. They belong to society, or they don't belong to anybody. But let's just say, for the sake of discussion, they belong to society. If they belong to the wider public, the wider society, then I don't think we can have this happening without some consultation about not only about the framing of the legislation in the first place, but about these tasks when they get licensed. And there's a substantial number of birds that are done. Now, many of the times, and I would emphasize this, there's good reason for this when you've got, for example, enormous risk to aircraft, and some birds need to be done. But there's a lot of other time where it looks pretty spurious, frankly. And when you look at, I recommend you have a look at this chap's website. You'll be quite surprised what goes on. And then, of course, I've already talked about secrecy about the badger colours, something I get quite aerated about. This is a letter I had in The Guardian some time ago, where we were arguing, a number of us, that this information should be in the public domain. If you're prepared to consult about fracking, a new hospital, a new motorway, you can consult people about the killing of wildlife on their doorstep. Seems to be absolutely clear to me. How's it evaluated? Well, it's quite clear to me that a lot of the time it's not evaluated. If you don't have no reporting, no recording, you have absolutely no idea about the effectiveness of what you're doing. And then, so therefore, you've got the sorts of things what I mentioned here. Here we have a whole series on the left-hand side of bycatch on a number of different species of birds. Yeah, they're all birds as far as I can tell, where clearly the traps are badly set, badly monitored, and the people that are doing it are not being held to account for what goes on. So we've got all sorts of things going wrong. And the irony is one of those birds is a red grouse, which is the very species they're trying to protect. On the right-hand side, glue traps catching bats. Again, extraordinarily crass practice. But if you don't plan properly, if you don't know what you're doing, this is what's going to happen. And then finally, labels. Animals are not vermin, they're not game, they're not pests, they're not problem species, they're animals. Going back to the business about sentience. And then I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes now. There's an important thing here. I talked about the lack of scrutiny of what goes on about wildlife killing. And I've compared this on this table here with the scrutiny that goes on farmed animals, on zoos and animal research establishments. It's difficult to make a comparison, but there is no independent inspectorate. There's no accountability which is any way comparable about the way in which animals are farmed, kept in zoos or animal research establishments. But there is a glow on the horizon, sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. RSPB, and again, it's a group that I work with now, they have been introducing rules for them because, of course, they do kill some wildlife. They kill deer to protect nightingale habitat because the browse means that there's no understory. They kill some crows to protect curlews and so forth, and they kill quite a few foxes. But they do this in a way which they are holding themselves to account, and they have these number of principles. And it's a start. And the more that wildlife NGOs, conservation NGOs can adopt these practices, trumpet the fact that they're doing them, the more likely we are to be able to hold the organizations that don't do this to account. So what would success look like? And I've listed this. I've said that terms like vermin and pests would no longer be used. The rationale for lethal trapping would be thoroughly tested, and therefore there'll be an overriding conservation or commercial reason before you're allowed to use it. And the non-lethal alternatives will have been tried and failed before you could start. There would be essentially a positive harm-benefit analysis done. So in other words, why as well as how. The operatives would be demonstrably competent. They'd have to be trained. They would have the equipment would have to always be approved and properly maintained, and only be available to competent people that have gone through third-party scrutiny. And then finally, there would be independent inspection of all of the activities that risk affecting animal welfare. And I think I just say a few words here. I don't know if you've ever read any Thoreau. I recommend that. It's a philosophy that I cling to. We want to have diverse, interesting wildlife, and let's not have an empty wildlife. Let's have an empty countryside where people make arbitrary decisions about which animal they want where and in which number. We want to have last sentence here. I should not like to think that some demigod had come before me and picked out some of the best of the actors. I wish to know an entire heaven and an entire earth. And then finally, just before Christmas, I'm going to plug my book. This came out in February this year, and Chris Packham has endorsed it, and it's now available from Pelagic Publishing, and you can also get it on Amazon at a substantial discount. Thank you very much. I can stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Alick. Wow, what a lot of info. Thank you for sharing. We've also got the link to your book, which we'll put in the chat. We've got a little bit of time, so I'd just like to invite, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Alick. And I would just like to mention on the, if people haven't seen it in the chat, but I've also shared the link to Humane Wildlife Solutions, which is the UK's 100% vegan, non-lethal and ethical alternative to pest control. So if anybody has any conflicts either at home or business, then they can contact Humane Wildlife Solutions, who will be able to help. So yeah, I'll hand over. If anybody has any questions, please feel free.
Oh dear, I think I've stunned everybody.
Hi, Libby.
Hello, everybody. Oh, thank you, Alick. That was really brilliant. You know how awful it is when somebody says this is more of a comment, but it is a comment. It's just that in Scotland we have a wildlife management bill going through the Scottish Parliament. It's just past stage 1, and I think it would go some way to meeting some of these issues you've raised, particularly with the general licenses, because it has a whole section on wildlife trap licensing. As far as I can understand, it means that even, you know, a granny like me, if I wanted to put a larsen trap in my back garden, God forbid, I would have to do a training course and have proper identification. So that is covered in the legislation. What isn't covered is any requirement to report as yet. Now, hopefully this will come in licensed conditions. But I was just thinking about what would success look like in those bullet points. And I was wondering what you thought the most important of these would be. I mean, there's transparency, isn't there? But you also mentioned just looking at the whole rationale for lethal trapping, because you know, we are going part of the way towards this with our Scottish legislation, but the assumption is still that it's necessary and justified as a default position.
Probably I didn't bring out, which is that the vast majority of killing of foxes, stoats and crows is to protect so-called game bird shooting. And as you probably know, the vast majority of the game birds that are shot in this country need to be released every year, and they're non-native. And there's, I think, equivocal evidence that the impact that these birds have, pheasants and red-legged partridges, have on the environment is detrimental in the first place. In addition to that, the likely amounts of carrion that are produced as a result of releasing tens of millions of these birds into the environment, because many of them get run over on the road, many of them get shot at and don't get picked up, or even just thrown in a ditch because nobody wants them. So the amount of carrion that's about, which will almost certainly increase the numbers of and density of foxes, is also impacting on the potential for other ground nesting species which are native and we want to protect. So one might argue that actually, if we had some way of controlling the release of these animals in the numbers they are, the impact on the environment would be less, and the need for killing native species like stoats, foxes, and crows would be reduced. Now, maybe that's being a bit naive, but again, I mentioned that, you know, nobody's consulted me about the killing of badgers that come into my garden. and I'm happy to have them there, I should emphasize, even though they do dig up the lawn. And it is that nobody ever asked me about whether I'm happy to have 25,000 pheasants released 2 or 3 miles away. And the damn things wander about my garden, poking at the plants and things like that. So it's about mutual respect for our wildlife, but mutual respect for the people that live in the environment that might want a different outcome and a different input.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, hi Alick.
Good morning, Bob, or good afternoon.
Hello, yeah, it's Bob Burzins here. Yes, nice to meet you. Yeah, just some sort of general questions about how we kind of reset societies, or the UK's sort of standards on what's regarded as humane and what's regarded as inhumane. I mean, it's great to have all the focus on wildlife there, and I agree with everything you've said this afternoon. But I'm just wondering, sort of your sort of lifetime of work as a veterinarian. You must have seen a big shift in the way that we go about our agriculture and with farmed animals. Particularly it seems to be that every pint of milk comes from an intensive dairy herd that never sees the light of day somewhere. And the same for pig farming and battery farming and the way that chickens are reared and all the rest of it. And it seems it looks to me as if our sort of welfare standards for farming for farmed animals have actually kind of decreased. And I'm just wondering how we can sort of go about resetting society's ideas of what is humane and how animals should be treated. It seems to be all about governments and legislation. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I hesitate to say this, but I go into a lot of what you've just asked about in the book. So there are 3 chapters on farming in there, and I'm very skeptical about the intensification of agriculture, particularly pigs and poultry. I spent a long time working on broilers in the early part of that is meat chickens in the early part of my career, but also inevitably, given what I was doing in the latter part of it, I was involved in the policy about the welfare and the legislation, both nationally but internationally, for farmed animals. And despite what you might think, the legislation for farmed animals has got more detailed and does require more input from farmers than it did in the past, particularly with poultry and to a lesser extent with pigs and even lesser extent with cattle. But there is basic rules which, if they're properly applied, the animals will live what I would have said was a reasonable life, a life worth living. Having said that, inevitably, as commercial pressures have been brought to bear on all types of farming, they've having to run faster and faster to stand still, which means that they tend to keep more animals with fewer people, with more automation, and inevitably less care per individual. And that creates its own problems. And I think particularly when it's with very, very large numbers of poultry, the care that can be applied to the individual is just about zero. The machinery looks after them. But when you take dairy cattle, where the individual value of that is well into 4 figures, these animals are well cared for notionally. But as you say, the environment in which they're living in is becoming more and more barren, and more less and less interesting for the animals. And particularly if you go down to what's called zero grazing, where the animals never go outside, then there are not only physiological and physical impacts, there will be psychological impacts of that on there. And I don't advocate a vegetarian diet, but I do advocate smarter purchasing of what animal products you use. And I can't say that I find that very easy. And I understand that many people, that when they realize that making choices about the way the products you buy, and therefore how you buy it and where you buy it from, to get animals or animal products reared from systems which do provide those things that we value and we believe are those animals of value, is very difficult. So I can understand why people say, I'm becoming vegetarian because I can't, they might do it for philosophical reasons, they might do it for ethical reasons, but sometimes it's actually simpler because you can't find the way through to get what you would say would be the right type of animal product. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so, but it's just the kind of the lack of kind of discussion or meaningful discussion on saying that actually a lot of what we do is inhumane, like the no grazing for cows in an intensive dairy farm. I mean, that's just kind of, it's just happened, and that seems like a step backwards for me. And then when you get on to all the wildlife stuff, I mean, the shooting estates that you mentioned, especially the grouse shooting ones, they've got their evidence. I don't know how, I don't know if it's peer reviewed and the rest of it, but they say, well, we're doing this to get more curlews. That's their standard kind of fallback. And of course, there's a lot more into that debate about the declining curlew numbers, about not being able to breed in the lowlands and all the rest of it. So it's a sort of, we kind of constantly fed a lot of misleading or not completely true information about animal welfare standards, and I'm just wondering how we can sort of affect that in government. How can we get politicians to think differently about those humaneness standards, both in wildlife and, as I mentioned, with farmed animals? So
yeah, I think it's very difficult. I mean, to be fair, the farming industry does try. I'm not sure it could try as much as it could do. And I also think that there is a bit of a bunker mentality, particularly in the meat industry, where they are very, very keen that people don't get to see what goes on. And I think openness is an important thing. And what's interesting about it is, and again, in the book, there's a chapter about research animals, and I'm involved in the regulation of research animals and the sort of ethical review of what goes on with them. And what I see there is a desire for more openness. And whilst they're not inviting busloads of people into laboratories, there's more information and more access to what's done, how it's done, how the people are held to account than there is with any other animal use. And given the necessary security that is around this, I think that's a big step forward. Have we got anybody else? Any questions? Lauren.
I don't have a question.
Well, don't feel obliged, but everybody's been very quiet.
No, that's just what I was going to say, but perhaps it just means that you've covered everything so well. So we've shared some useful links in the chat as well, if people haven't had a chance to see that yet. The link to your book as well. And also really interesting questions and comments from Bob there as well. I think it definitely opens up a wider thought process and issues about how we interact with animals and how our lives sort of are entwined, and the different things that we can do on our personal level, like what Libby mentioned about how we might be required to do one thing and not required to do another, and how does that sit with us ethically in our own decisions. So I think all of this conversation is really useful in helping different people sort of think about their own activities and what's going on around them, living in the countryside or or whatnot as well, and be aware of what's going on as well. I think that's a lot of, many people have no idea that there may well be, snares set on their back doorstep, sort of where they walk their dog, or, different traps that are used, and what do they look like, and are they legal or illegal, and, all these kinds of things. There's so many.
It's complicated as well. And actually, just going back to what Bob said, there's lots of organizations, yours in particular, but there's a number of other ones that do a lot of not necessarily exposure, but campaigning about the way in which animals are reared. And one of them is Compassion World Farming, and they do quite a lot of awareness and good campaigns. And I mean, I wouldn't say I necessarily agree with absolutely everything they do, but they are absolutely on them. They're absolutely working with resolve and steely determination. They're never going to give up, and they don't compromise. So well worth having a look at what they do. Compassion World Farming, I recommend them.
Definitely. And I just wanted to touch on a comment that you made earlier, which I think is really interesting, and I know that we've mentioned it before as well, is that regardless of how everybody lives their lives, we can all do things to improve the lives of animals. And you mentioned as well about accessing sort of higher animal welfare products. It can be really difficult and tricky for people to navigate as we live in a world with amazing marketing. It can be really difficult for people to choose higher welfare products. Even I know when I shop in my local Tesco and I see sort of pictures of salmon on the packets, and there's a beautiful loch that's depicted on the front of that packet, and it's loch made up, but I know that, but so many people have no idea that these are just clever marketing tricks to convince people that what they're buying is a high welfare product from this loch, which actually doesn't exist. So it can be really difficult. It
is difficult, and it's difficult to make choices, which is why I empathize with people that say, because the information is not there, I'm just avoiding it altogether. But I also think it's quite important that there are some things that you can vote with your feet about, like, for example, what you're going to eat or what shoes you might wear. But there's quite a lot of things where you can't vote with your feet. And when it comes to sort of wildlife protection or campaign against research, if that's what your view is, and I would emphasize that I'm not against animal research. I'm against certain types of animal research, because I think there are many benefits that come from some animal research. But I would also say that we can only start to hold institutions, governments, and so forth to account by acting collectively with the things where you don't have the ability to vote with your feet. So you can't say, I'm having nothing to do with animal research, because you don't contribute to it. You're not doing it on a daily basis. So the only way to do that would be to start campaigning by joining a bigger organization. And certainly if you join a bigger organization, the advice you can get about how you might try and influence your MP position on various different things like that is often very good.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it is, go and talk to your MP. We just had a new one because the other one got his fingers caught in something just a few weeks ago, and I've been to see her already and bent her ear about badgers and trapping as well, actually, and she made the right noises. But I'm going to keep pressing her, because the more people do it from different directions, the more the emphasis can build up. And one kind's success over snares, you led it, but a lot of other people were poking from different directions as well, and that's where it works. The idea that you're going to overturn a whole series of things that you're uncomfortable about by writing a whole series of form letters, and that's all. You've got to have. I mean, I worked with a group that were pushing hard on trying to get decapods, crabs, brought under the scope of the animal welfare law. They're called crustacean compassion, and they draw all sorts of people. They were pushing parliamentarians, they were doing little videos, they were getting people like me to write letters and various different things like that. And they've been quite successful because what they do is approach from a different way, and they have a long-term plan rather than just one big push.
Yeah.
Because of one big push, you just get a splash and it goes.
Absolutely. I'm sure Libby and Bob could share a little
Yeah,
bit.
well, they know much more about it than I do.
The tenacity required and the determination to sort of rally all the troops and be in it for the long game. So it's we are definitely in for that, and it's thanks to everybody here as well that we can keep doing that. So but yeah, I think that was a fantastic session. If anybody has any last questions, I would encourage you to do it now, just because we're a little bit tight on time. And if,
don't forget, you've got lots more webinars, haven't you?
Absolutely, we have another one in
somewhat less somewhat less morbid than this. I think you've got somebody talking about vegan desserts, which
that's me.
Oh, is it? Excellent. Right. Well, I hope that goes well.
Gosh, me too. No, but yeah, we have lots of webinars, but I think it's great. We really wanted to cover a wide variety of topics just to show that whoever we are and wherever we are, we can all absolutely do something to incorporate into our lives to, create some more compassion and a kinder world for animals. And I think your session is really important to highlight what is going on. Things might be legal, it doesn't mean they're ethical, and it's important that we know that so that we can start to challenge that. And Libby, it's on Thursday. I'll send you an email. But we have to understand the realities before we can start posing the questions, and then sort of think about how do we approach this and how do we try to make changes for the better for animals going forward. So I think, your session has been fantastic. I've seen lots of really positive comments come in as well while we've been speaking. So thank you so much for that. And if anybody does have any questions afterwards, maybe you haven't thought of now, please feel free to email us at info@onekind.org, and we'll get back to you. And this recording will be up online in the new year, and we'll share when that's ready.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for listening.
No, thank you. And so thanks so much for your time, everybody. Hope to see you all soon.
Yeah, okay, bye.
Thank you.